On Thanksgiving, my parents sold the family's second villa and left me with nothing. Thanksgiving is supposed to be a day of family, warmth, and gratitude, a time to gather, share a meal, and feel connected. But that night, as the golden glow of candles lit the dining room and the smell of roasted turkey filled the air, my parents dropped a bomb that shattered everything I thought I knew about our family. Because with casual smiles, they proudly announced they had sold the family's second villa, the place with white shutters, a wide porch, and a sparkling blue pool where I had learned to swim at 6, where my grandmother told me bedtime stories on warm summer nights, where I celebrated my sweet 16 surrounded by friends and glowing lanterns, a house that wasn't just property but memories, promises, and my supposed future, and in one careless moment it was erased. The entire room erupted in cheers, my brother raising his glass, my aunt praising the wise financial move, my mother glowing with pride, everyone clapping and laughing as if it were the greatest news of the year. Everyone except me, because in the very same breath, they made it clear that their daughter would receive nothing. I froze, fork suspended in midair, heart pounding, ears filled with hollow laughter that suddenly sounded cruel. And for a moment I thought I had misheard, that maybe they would explain. But no, the truth was as blunt as the words they had spoken. I was excluded, cut out, dismissed. I tried to hold a polite smile, but my cousin leaned in and whispered, "Guess the market's hot. Wow, I didn't think they'd actually sell it." Her voice casual. Oblivious to the storm inside me, and I wanted to scream, to shout that this wasn't about markets or money, but about betrayal. Yet no words came out, my throat tight, my chest burning, while around me, glasses clinked in celebration of a future that no longer included me. Finally, I managed to whisper, my voice trembling, "Wait, what about me? I thought the villa was supposed to—" But my father cut me off with a dismissive flick of his hand, his tone cool and detached. "You'll be fine, you don't need it. We've decided the proceeds will stay in the family for more practical purposes." And my blood ran cold because I knew what that meant. It was never about the family. It was always about my brother, the golden child, the chosen heir, the one they invested everything into, while I was nothing more than the daughter, the afterthought. My brother's smirk confirmed everything. He wasn't surprised. He had known, perhaps even orchestrated it. And in his eyes I saw the smug satisfaction of someone who knew the game had been rigged all along. The turkey turned to dust in my mouth, the mashed potatoes like sand, so I excused myself quietly, murmuring something about water, and slipped into the kitchen where my hands trembled as I gripped the marble counter, the laughter spilling in from the dining room like poison, each chuckle and toast slicing into me like a blade. I pulled out my phone, desperate to text someone who might understand. But who could I tell? My best friend who would never understand how wealth could be used as a weapon. My colleagues who would think me spoiled for caring, because to them it would look like greed. But this wasn't about money, it was about being erased, about being told in front of the people I loved that I was worth nothing. From the dining room I heard my mother's voice, warm and proud, praising my brother for his ambition and responsibility, my father's booming tone bragging that the family's legacy would live on through him. And not once, not a single time, did my name cross their lips. I had become invisible, forgotten, discarded. Something inside me cracked then, the hurt twisting into a colder anger, a sharp defiance. Because for years I had been quiet, the accommodating daughter, the one who let things slide for the sake of family peace, but not anymore, not this time. I wasn't going to let them erase me so easily, not without a fight. Sitting alone in that kitchen, I thought about how maybe they saw this as punishment for the path I had chosen. My brother mirroring my father with a career in finance, while I chose art, design, creativity, passion, things that didn't come with quarterly profits or boardroom prestige. And perhaps in their eyes that made me unworthy, less valuable, less deserving, but I knew the truth. This wasn't about practicality. It was about control, about silencing me, about keeping power in one place. And in that cold kitchen, with laughter echoing through the walls, I made a silent vow. Thanksgiving would not end with me as the forgotten daughter. They might think they had erased me, but they had only awakened something far stronger. Because if they wanted to play this game, I was finally ready. And as they laughed and toasted over pumpkin pie in the other room, I began to plan. I returned to the table with a mask of calm carefully painted on my face. Though inside I felt like a storm tearing through me, every laugh and every toast slicing deeper. But I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break, not yet. Because in that moment I realized that sometimes silence is sharper than words. So I sat down, folded my napkin neatly across my lap, and observed, recording every expression, every smug smile, every careless gesture that confirmed what I had always feared, that I was nothing more than an accessory in this family, useful when convenient, invisible when inconvenient. But what they didn't know was that invisibility has power, because when no one sees you, you see everything. My brother bragged about new ventures, my father encouraged him with that booming pride, and my mother chimed in with little anecdotes designed to showcase his brilliance, while I sat like a ghost at the feast, smiling politely, nodding at the right moments. But my mind was working, calculating, replaying every time they had dismissed me, every subtle cut and every stolen opportunity. And I began to piece together a pattern, one that told me this was not sudden. This betrayal had been brewing for years, carefully crafted, hidden in plain sight, and tonight was simply the unveiling. As dessert was served, my aunt leaned over with a conspiratorial smile and whispered how lucky I was to be free of responsibility. How nice it must feel not to have the weight of family property on my shoulders. And I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it, because what she saw as freedom was actually exile. But I only nodded, sipping at my wine. And in that moment something hardened within me. Not despair but resolve, because if they wanted me out, then I would show them what it meant to truly be independent, to build something of my own that no inheritance could touch, and perhaps even to take back what they thought they had stolen. After the table cleared and the family drifted into the living room for coffee and board games, I slipped away to the study, the place where my father kept his files, his ledgers, his carefully locked cabinets that everyone pretended not to notice, but everyone knew contained the real family secrets. And standing there in the dim light, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound books and the faint smell of cigar smoke, I felt a daring I had never felt before, a hunger for truth that outweighed my fear of being caught. I knelt by the desk, checked the usual drawers, all locked. But when I pressed lightly along the underside, I found what I half expected. A small magnetic key taped out of sight, a detail my father probably thought too clever for anyone to discover. But he had forgotten that I grew up in this house, that I used to sit under this very desk playing hide and seek, that I knew its creaks and grooves better than he ever realized. With trembling hands, I opened the cabinet, and there it was, folders neatly labeled. Bank statements, property deeds, trust documents, all in my father's precise handwriting, and as I flipped through them, my breath caught. Because here was proof that this wasn't simply about selling a villa. This was about years of deliberate maneuvering, shifting assets, transferring titles, rewriting wills in secrecy, all funneling towards one outcome, ensuring everything passed to my brother. My name was absent, erased, as though I had never been born, as though the daughter who once baked pies for these gatherings, who sat by her grandmother's side in that villa, who painted murals on its walls, had been nothing more than a guest, a temporary shadow. The rage that surged through me was icy, focused, no longer the desperate hurt of a child wanting approval, but the steely fury of a woman realizing she had been underestimated all along. And as I copied key documents with the scanner I found tucked in a drawer, emailing them to my private account, I whispered to myself that they had made a mistake. A terrible mistake, because they had shown their hand too soon. When I returned to the living room, they barely noticed, too engrossed in their games and chatter, too secure in their triumph, and I smiled to myself, knowing that while they played checkers, I was already learning chess. Later, in the quiet of my room, I scrolled through the documents on my phone, my pulse quickening with every page because I saw patterns of mismanagement, of shady dealings that could unravel if exposed, and I began to see not just my exclusion, but their vulnerability, cracks in the perfect image my parents had worked so hard to display. And for the first time that night, I felt not powerless, but powerful. Because knowledge is power, and now I held the truth. I lay awake long after the laughter downstairs had faded, staring at the ceiling, replaying their words, their smiles, their betrayal, and instead of tears, I felt a strange calm. Because I knew tomorrow would not be the same as yesterday, that everything had changed, not just for me, but for them too. Though they didn't know it yet, because when you cut someone out, you should never forget that sometimes the one you discard is the one who learns how to fight the hardest. As dawn began to lighten the sky, I whispered to myself a vow as steady as stone. They may have sold the villa. They may have erased my name, but this story was far from over, because Thanksgiving might have been their victory, but the rest of the year would be mine. The morning after Thanksgiving arrived wrapped in silence, the kind that feels heavy rather than peaceful, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. And when I came downstairs, the house was already alive with the usual sounds of family. Chatter, the clink of cups, the smell of coffee drifting through the air. But beneath the ordinary routine was a new current, one I could feel in every glance that brushed past me, every smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, because whether they admitted it aloud or not, they knew that I had heard their message, that I understood I had been erased. My brother sat at the kitchen island, leaning back like a king surveying his domain. And when our eyes met, he smirked as if to remind me of my place. But I did not flinch. I simply poured my coffee slowly, deliberately, holding his gaze just long enough to unsettle him before walking away. At the table, my mother chirped about holiday sales, and my father discussed investment strategies, words that once might have washed over me in boredom, but now struck me as weapons, subtle reminders of the world from which I had been cut out. And yet I listened intently, storing every phrase, every number, every careless mention of accounts and assets they thought too complicated for me to follow, unaware that I had already spent half the night studying their files, learning their patterns, seeing through their disguises. At one point, my father looked at me with that rehearsed mix of patience and dismissal he had perfected over the years and asked if I was still dabbling in my design work, the word dabbling twisting like a knife because it was how he always dismissed my career, as if my passion was a child's hobby rather than a growing business. And for the first time I did not shrink back or defend myself. I simply smiled and said, "Yes, still dabbling, and business is better than you think," letting my calm confidence hang in the air until he looked away. That small shift filled me with a quiet satisfaction, proof that I could push back without shouting, that I could unsettle them by refusing to play the role they had written for me. As the day went on, I began to notice more, subtle cracks in the golden image of my brother's perfection. A phone call he took in the hallway with his voice low and sharp, a flash of worry in his eyes when he checked his messages, the quick way he shut down conversation whenever finances got too detailed. And I realized he was not as secure as he pretended, that perhaps this empire they were building around him was built on sand. That realization gave me a new kind of courage, the courage to test boundaries. So when the family gathered in the afternoon to go over holiday plans, and my father once again spoke of the villa as if it had never been mine to dream of, I leaned forward and asked casually, how did the buyers feel about the plumbing issue in the East Wing? The room went silent, my brother's face paling, my father's eyes narrowing, because they had not expected me to know about that, yet I had seen it buried in the inspection report tucked in the files I had copied, and in that instant I watched their confidence falter, just slightly, just enough to confirm that I was no longer the ignorant daughter they thought I was. My mother recovered quickly, laughing lightly and brushing my comment aside, but the seed of doubt was planted, and I saw it in the flicker of my brother's gaze, in the way my father's hand tightened on his glass. They knew I knew something, and that knowledge was power. That evening I slipped out to walk in the garden, needing the cold air to clear my head, and as I walked past the bare trees and the crunch of leaves underfoot, I thought about the years I had spent seeking their approval, the way I had bent myself into shapes that never fit, the way I had swallowed words and dreams to keep peace. And I realized with startling clarity that I no longer needed their approval. I only needed my own resolve. When I returned inside, I found my brother waiting in the hallway, his expression sharper now, stripped of its smug veneer, and he leaned close enough that only I could hear and whispered, "Don't make trouble for yourself, it's done, you." Lost, accept it. His tone cold, his confidence forced, and I met his eyes steadily and whispered back, "We'll see." That moment marked a shift. The first open confrontation, small and quiet, but undeniable. And from then on, I carried myself differently, not as the discarded daughter, but as someone holding cards they didn't know existed. That night, alone, in my room, I began to sketch, not just my designs, but my plan, lines and shapes that turned into strategies, timelines, possibilities, because I knew that if I tried to fight them with anger or emotion, they would dismiss me as dramatic. But if I fought with precision, with evidence, with patience, I could dismantle their game piece by piece. The villa might be gone, the money diverted, but the story was not finished, because stories are not written in assets alone, but in the truths that come to light. And I had seen enough to know that their truths were fragile, built on secrets and arrogance, and all I needed to do was shine the right light at the right time. As I drifted into uneasy sleep, one thought pulsed through me with steady fire. They thought Thanksgiving was the end of me, but it was only the beginning. The following week unfolded with an icy precision I had not felt in years, as if the clarity born from betrayal had burned away every trace of hesitation, leaving only focus. And each day I woke earlier, moved quieter, thought sharper, no longer bound by the haze of seeking approval, but fueled by the cold fire of purpose. On Monday morning, while my brother slept off the weekend's indulgences, I drove into the city, not to my studio, but to the courthouse, where I filed requests for copies of public property records, tracing the sales, the transfers, the loans, and what I uncovered sent a tremor of vindication through me. The villa they had flaunted as a triumph had been sold under pressure, its proceeds already funneled into covering my brother's mounting debts. Debts they had carefully hidden behind layers of shell accounts, but not carefully enough, because paper trails always bleed through the cracks for those who know where to look. Each discovery became a weapon I tucked away quietly, never letting my face betray what I knew, because timing was everything, and I intended to strike only once their arrogance left them most exposed. On Wednesday, I met with Leah, my best friend, finally confessing the full story over coffee in the corner of a quiet cafe. And as I spoke, her eyes widened with anger on my behalf, but she also leaned in with that practical sharpness that had always balanced my emotions, suggesting contacts she knew in financial circles, journalists hungry for a story of betrayal and inheritance abuse, even attorneys who specialized in estate fraud, and I realized I was not alone in this fight. That while my family sought to isolate me, I was quietly building an army of my own. By Thursday, I had in my possession not only financial records, but also screenshots of my brother's increasingly desperate messages to lenders, his voicemails to associates begging for extensions. Proof that the golden boy was not a savior, but a liability. And as I studied them late into the night, I began to see the outline of my strategy, not just as revenge, but as revelation. To show the world, and perhaps even the extended family and community who worshipped their image, exactly who they truly were. The opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. When my mother announced with smug delight that we would be hosting a holiday reception in December, a gathering of family friends, business associates, people whose opinions mattered deeply to her social standing. And as she spoke about caterers and decorations, I knew this would be the stage, the perfect moment to unveil the truth, because nothing cut deeper into their pride than public exposure. Over the next days, I played the role of dutiful daughter flawlessly, smiling at the right moments, offering to assist with preparations, pretending I was resigned, all while carefully laying groundwork, securing copies of every document, aligning Leah and her contacts as silent witnesses, ready to confirm what I would reveal. At night, I rehearsed my words, not of bitterness, but of undeniable fact, statements so sharp they would slice through their defenses before they even knew how to respond. By the time the night of the reception arrived, I felt a strange calm, the calm of someone standing on the edge of a cliff, not in fear, but in certainty of the leap. Guests filled the house, laughter and music spilling through polished halls, the chandeliers casting golden light on faces that had once intimidated me, but now felt like an audience waiting for truth. My brother basked in attention. My mother paraded her charm. My father shook hands with the air of untouchable authority. But beneath it all, I saw the cracks, the hurried whispers between them, the tension in their eyes when conversations edged too close to money. When my father finally raised his glass to make a toast about family legacy, about strength and unity, I stepped forward, my own glass untouched, and with a steady voice that carried through the room I said, "It's interesting to hear about legacy when some of us have been erased from it entirely." The room stilled, eyes turning toward me, surprise rippling through the crowd. And before my father could deflect, I continued, each word clear, deliberate, undeniable. "Last week my parents sold the family villa, the one many of you have visited, and none of the proceeds were shared with me, their daughter, despite years of promises. Instead, that money went to cover my brother's hidden debts, debts they have concealed while painting him as a pillar of success. What you see here tonight is not legacy but illusion," gasps rippled. Whispers rising, my mother's face flushing crimson, my brother paling as he stammered, but I was not finished, because I had brought the receipts. From my bag I drew the neatly bound folder, the same one I had prepared night after night, and laid it open on the central table where curious guests could see bank records, loan documents, property transfers highlighted in careful detail. The story written in numbers no denial could erase. Leah moved subtly through the room, ensuring people saw, whispering confirmations to those who questioned. And as I spoke of manipulation, of favoritism, of betrayal, I felt years of silence breaking inside me, not with anger, but with clarity. My father tried to interrupt, dismissing it as exaggeration. But before he could regain control, one of his own associates, a man with sharp eyes and a quicker mind, stepped forward, glanced at the papers, and asked my brother directly, "Is it true you leveraged the villa sale to cover your personal loans?" The question struck like lightning, and my brother's stuttered denial rang hollow in the charged silence, his charm unraveling before dozens of witnesses. My mother tried to steer the conversation back to celebration, but the crowd was no longer under her spell. They were murmuring, doubting, seeing cracks they would never forget. I stood calm amidst the storm, my heart pounding but my voice steady, because this was not just revenge, it was liberation. Proof that I was no longer their silent victim, but their equal adversary. And as the night collapsed around them, I knew the battle had only just begun. The hours after my revelation unraveled like a storm that could not be contained, each moment pulling another thread from the fabric of the illusion my parents had woven for so many years. And though the guests eventually left in waves of uncomfortable silence, their faces etched with shock and gossip already forming on their tongues, I knew nothing would ever be the same again, not for me and not for them. That night my brother locked himself in his room, his phone buzzing endlessly with unanswered calls from creditors who had no doubt heard whispers already. My mother sat in the living room clutching her wine glass like a lifeline, her hands shaking with rage more than fear, and my father paced endlessly, muttering about damage control, public relations, how to salvage their reputation. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that their empire of appearances was crumbling faster than he could patch it. I did not stay long enough to watch the collapse in detail because I realized I did not need to. I had already set the avalanche in motion, and the weight of truth was heavier than anything I could carry on my own. So I gathered my things, thanked Leah, who gave me a fierce, proud hug, and I left that house for the last time with the kind of calm that only comes from knowing you have finally broken free of chains you once mistook for love. In the days that followed, the fallout spread quickly. Whispers among their circle hardened into judgments. Old friends pulled away, business partners hesitated, and the glossy image of our family, that had been carefully curated through charity galas and holiday cards, shattered under the weight of financial records and betrayal, leaving only fragments that no one wanted to pick up. My brother tried desperately to spin a narrative of being misunderstood, of exaggerated debts and family disagreements, but creditors do not accept excuses, and when his defaults became public, it was not pity he received, but ridicule. The golden boy turned cautionary tale almost overnight. My parents, furious at me yet unable to silence the growing noise, attempted to paint me as an ungrateful daughter seeking attention. But the evidence spoke louder than their words, and the more they denied, the more people questioned their integrity. I watched all of this from a distance, no longer their scapegoat, but not entirely untouched. Because betrayal leaves scars even when you win. And I found myself in quiet moments grieving the family I had once believed in, the parents I had once trusted, the brother I had once loved enough to protect. But grief, I learned, could coexist with freedom, and as weeks turned to months, I began to build a life not defined by them, but by me. I poured my energy back into my design work, accepting projects I had once declined out of obligation to family events, traveling to cities I had only dreamed of, and surrounding myself with friends who valued me for who I was rather than what name I carried. The villa was gone, the inheritance denied, but in its place I had something far more valuable: self-respect and a future untethered to their manipulation. When the holidays returned a year later, I did not sit at their table waiting for crumbs of approval. Instead, I hosted my own gathering, small but warm, filled with laughter that came from real joy rather than rehearsed performance. And as I raised my glass with people who had chosen to stand by me, I realized that family was not always the one you were born into, but sometimes the one you built yourself. I still heard occasionally about my parents, about my brother, their struggles to maintain the life they had flaunted while debts and distrust closed in around them. And though part of me once imagined satisfaction in their downfall, what I actually felt was something quieter, almost bittersweet. Because revenge had never been the true reward, it was the freedom to walk away, to thrive without their shadows looming over me. On Thanksgiving that year, I sat by the window of my small but bright apartment, the city lights glowing like scattered stars. And I thought back to that night when they announced the villa's sale, when they told me I would receive nothing, and I smiled because they had been wrong. They had given me something after all, not money or property, but the fire to claim my worth, the clarity to see through illusions, and the courage to finally step into a life of my own making. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is not wealth passed down, but the strength you find when you are forced to stand alone. And in that sense, I had inherited more than they could ever understand.